to Challenging Paradigm X. My guest today is Monika Bielskyte. Monika is a futurist, futurist designer, and futures researcher. She has a highly interesting perception and perspective of reality. And this is the reason why I am particularly glad to have her as a guest on my final episode of this podcast. So if you're interested to find out more, stay tuned. Hi, here's Xerxes, and today I'm here with Monika. Monika, it's a pleasure to have you here at my podcast. Please introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Thank you. Nice to be here with you today and with the audience whenever they'll find this. I'm Monika Bielskyte. I'm futures researcher, futurist, and futures designer. Those are sort of generalizations of what I do. The foundation of all my work is really futures research. It's really, what informs everything that I do. Um, Especially before the pandemic, I used to travel quite a lot because for me it was very important to put my body, where the future happens, to really actually experience things firsthand, rather than just sort of look things up on the internet and sort of see futures from afar. Um, a lot of my work is really about identifying. Sort of these signs and what a lot of others might perceive as minority voices, um, and distinguish sort of the signal from the noise, and what a lot of others will see sort of minority voice, distinguish that as, who and what of that is a pioneering voice. Right. So where is really that bleeding edge, not the cutting edge, but truly the bleeding edge. Um, at the same time, I'm not an academic myself, but I collaborate a lot with people from the academia. And in general, I'm much more of a synthesizer. I spend my days and sometimes nights engaging with people that I consider to be much more brilliant than me in any particular given discipline. So across scientific, technological, cultural, social, political innovation, as well as also history. So by reading their books, by having direct conversations with my peers across all of these different disciplines, and then sort of trying to make sense of, how all of these disciplines, and all of these areas and all of these different sort of cultural aspects affect each other. So I'm really interested in the feedback loop between our cultural, social, political values and priorities and scientific and technological innovation. Because I don't think that one or the other thing just sort of leads each other. It's in continuous conversation and in continuous that interrelationship. Right. So that's really what I do as a researcher. Then, as a futurist, I do workshops, lectures within academic context, within grassroots context, and sometimes within governmental and corporate context. Now, what I see as my role is really my futurism is also my activism. So instead of just passively discerning some kind of trends in the future and just presenting them, especially within a corporate setting, in order to make more profit, is definitely not my vocation. What I'm trying to do is to help people within all of these different organizations see and understand, well, what could be the worst case scenarios and how do we work to actually avoid them. How can we work towards something that can be successful, right? That can have positive impact and that would not obviously be a total commercial failure, but at the same time really considering a more of a long-term vision and long-term goals rather than the short-term profits. That's really important for me, to not just be sort of a passive observer and passive discerner that utilizes my knowledge just to benefit the few that already benefit the most, but really, how can we shape the future of humanity in a way that is really about radical hope and radical inclusivity. Which leads to the last thing that I do, and that is being involved with future related media. And so I have worked on different science fiction properties in the form of films and TV series and documentaries. As a creative partner to directors, helping them really understand different aspects of the futures that they depict. Right, so within the more of a science fiction realm, um, I help directors to understand different areas of science, technology, culture, give feedback to their scripts, when necessary, bring on board, again, people that have very unique and very specific knowledge in any particular, political, cultural, but especially scientific or technological area. So that the story that we're telling is actually informed and grounded in reality, even if it's fiction. The foundations of it is real knowledge, real understandings. um, and then sometimes I stay with the production all the way into that pre-visualization part, where I would work with different concept artists, illustrators, sometimes animators, but mostly illustrators and concept artists and concept designers, to start fleshing out these first visions of the world, right? So what is that? Um, what is that story world about, right? What is that setting within which the narrative of a particular film or TV series happens? So that's one thing. And then, more recently, I've also been a bit involved with future related documentaries, and more specifically to help directors see, you know, the less obvious aspects of the future and more of a critique of technological colonialism, of different, racist, misogynist, anti-indigenous biases within scientific research, etc., etc. So kind of try to bring in more of, again, what people would see or identify as minority voices, but I would identify as pioneering voices. So a bit of an alternative and much more critical narrative of what is the story of the future that we are telling ourselves, and more importantly, well, what is the story maybe that we should be telling that we have not been telling, that has been in some way erased. Similarly, how a lot of histories have been erased for very strategic purposes of exploitation, domination, oppression, dehumanization, etc., etc. Um, but that on one side, having worked a lot with technology companies, I used to be quite involved since that's the very beginnings of the third wave of VR, back in 2013, basically around the time that Oculus was being sold to Facebook. um, I got quite involved in virtual reality. From my very early days in it, I was more interested in thinking about it not as the future of entertainment as a medium, but more really as, well, what is the future of computation, right? How the so-called XR, so extended reality, sometimes they'll call mixed reality, but I like this idea of extended reality. It's really where the computation is going, right? We're moving away from computational screens to computational spaces. And so what type of opportunities, but what kind of risks, dangers, issues, et cetera, it entails. And, if we want to do it better, we have to be as critical as possible about all of it, and especially about, the fundamentals of user experience and user interface, because that shift from the screen-based computation into the spatial computation is really, really quite radical. All right, because the way it affects our brains, the way it affects our bodies, the way it can trigger certain trauma experiences and trauma reactions, is really quite a bit of a radical change. So on one side, I've been quite involved with the tech industry. On the other side, I've been quite involved with the entertainment industry. And what I started seeing is that, on one side, you have this dystopia fetishism. Most of the mainstream, especially Hollywood narratives about the future, they are about this. Yeah, they are essentially a dystopia fetishism. It's always these visions of the end of the world that actually are quite disconnected from the the real scenarios, the sort of the most prescient scenarios that we are now seeing towards the end of the world. An example, it's always some kind of, one giant catastrophe, some kind of like giant wave or giant whatever, climatic event, rather than the slow burn apocalypse of the actual climate change and biosphere collapse. Right, so it's always exaggerated, or like asteroid hitting the earth, or like alien invasions, that we can go much deeper into that, about sort of the sort of hidden racist, xenophobic undertones within a lot of these narratives. I think that would be quite interesting to unpack. But essentially, dystopia fetishism within the entertainment industry, it's become the most lazy way to approach future storytelling. Not that there was no place for dystopia, especially back in the 80s, when when especially 60s and all that, like with all the sort of vision of the Jetsons and the futures, because it's going to be this happy suburban flying car, whatever nonsense. So, at that time, especially works by people like Octavia Butler, or I think, William Gibson, there was a real place for that. But what it has become today, especially in film and TV series format, um, it's become a lazy cop out. It's much easier to just look at all the sci-fi that has been done and reproduce the same tropes. Um, then actually imagine something better, imagine something that's inspiring, in a future tense. And it has a very negative effect. On one side, for the general audiences, it disengages us from participating in shaping our own future, because we always have this narrative being fed to us that whatever we do, the future, the story of the future is always of this impending doom. So there's nothing you can do about it, right? And so it disengages us on one side. On the other side, a lot of these narratives become, something even much worse. They become very much product roadmaps, for either nefarious sort of state actors, authoritarian, totalitarian, sort of wannabe state actors, or corporations that want to cash in, through disaster capitalism. And that's very, very problematic. And what that leads me to is ultimately the techno utopianism, and tech solutionism of Silicon Valley and technology industry in general, and that whole kind of like California ideology initially pioneered by people like Stuart Brand, that technology is the answer to everything. All our problems, are going to be solved by, AI is going to bring this state, what Peter Diamandis and figures like that preach, the state of infinite abundance, et cetera, et cetera. The whole crypto communism, whatever stuff. In colonial space visions, um, actually, that stuff is not the answer, because it directly trickles down from a lot of these dystopian visions. And what was happening in the early stages of augmented and virtual reality funding is you were literally having these images from surveillance state dystopia films such as Minority Report, filtering into these sort of VC decks and saying, oh, we want to build Minority Report technology. And then companies like Palantir obviously then setting out and literally doing that. Predictive crime tech with all of its racial bias that they were illicitly testing in New Orleans, right? So it becomes this direct sort of product roadmap. The dystopias become product roadmaps for techno utopians, and what that led me to think is also how maybe not just techno utopianism, but utopianism in general is not the answer to dystopia. And when you sort of start unpacking not just the history of futurism, which we can also go deeper into, but just the history of utopianism, it is completely tied with profoundly ableist, profoundly queerphobic, profoundly racist and anti-indigenous eugenics thinking, right? And so utopia is inseparable from that. And when you think of the Manifest Destiny and American Colonial Project, that was a utopian project. When you think of the Nazi Germany with all this idea of its Umwelt and Lebensraum, etc., for the Aryan peoples, that only required to kill, 6 million Jewish people and Roma people and queer people and disabled people, etc., and commit horrendous, crimes against humanity, through like just the most perverse scientific, experimentation on the prisoners. That was the cost for the Aryan utopia. And then the apartheid state, was a utopia for the Afrikaners, the price being paid by everybody one shade darker than white. So these were utopian projects, and so much of today's utopian thinking, even within the realms that should be quite interesting, such as solar punk and hope punk, oftentimes perpetuate that. And I think the fundamental issue with a lot of utopian thinking is that it tries to leapfrog the present day problems and just go into, well, don't you worry, we'll find ways to solve it, predominantly through technology and technology afforded abundance. We're going to just solve all of these, society is just going to become post-race, post-gender, post-nation state, etc. Now, I'm not saying that that's not an admirable goal. I really want to imagine a society that is post-race, post-gender, post, nation state, as not as libertarian sort of heaven, but nation state as competing nation states. That do not consider all of, each and every one themselves as ultimately part of that same planetary civilization. So but we can't leapfrog into that. In order to make a better future, first of all, we have to understand the past injustice, and then we need to address that. And then we need to repair that, and only then we can start thinking, well, what is that long-term idea? If you don't want to address the present day's inequities, you will never build something that does not perpetuate it. So sorry, such a long introduction. But all of these things led me to start the project Protopia Futures, which is really, it's a collaborative research and creation platform to challenge dystopian, utopian stereotypes, and to also start to attempt to create alternative visions to that through science fiction language, but very much rooted in real cultural, political, social, technological, scientific realities, rather than just sort of fantastical stuff. And and really fundamentally think of technology just an extension of our biology, just as tools, not like a thing that has its own agency or some kind of magical answer. None of that really. Technology flows out of our cultural, political, social goals and values. It's not a thing of its own. It doesn't have a predetermined direction. Uh, so yeah.
I'd like to know, why do you do what you do?
Why do I do what I do? It's a survival strategy, for sure. So several things. I'm a pathologically curious person. I don't know if I should ascribe myself. I've been questioning a lot the colonial ideas of mental health and especially mental illness. But if you look at it from the perspective of how the Western world identifies it, I think I definitely live my life with PTSD and depression from early childhood, and symptoms of ADHD, autism, that kind of stuff. So I have very low threshold for boredom. I have to continuously learn. Like I really struggle to just do something mechanically. I love, and that goes even into my personal life. Like I love to move my body, but I could never just go to the gym. So I'm for example training in the circus school, because when I go to the circus school, it's so easy for me to motivate myself, because every day my teacher's teaching me something new. On the silks, on the ropes, on the hoops, on lyras, on like all of these. Like now I actually want to start climbing the walls, and that's like a really exciting challenge. And and that really motivates me, right? And then I feel like, okay, I can come back home and I can do my push-ups and the crunches and all of that, because I have that goal of then being able to do something I've never previously done. So I think this ADHD related pathological curiosity is definitely a massive driver. I realized that I must, to be happy, I must create myself a life where I'm never in that static realm, but I'm in a realm where I'm continuously learning. So my job has to provide me that. And I absolutely need to pay my bills. I'm unfortunately not in a position where I could just pursue my dreams. I really, really need to pay my rent. So it was kind of finding that sweet spot that allows me to not end up on a street, but also allows me to continuously learn. And so I think my job is a blessing and a curse, because it's such a vast space that you never ever know, you never ever feel that you know enough. So it's a bit anxiety inducing, and I suffered, from quite severe anxiety in my life. So that is not helpful. That is not helpful, because I sometimes, beat myself up, and through imposter syndrome, kind of feel like, I really don't know enough. But then on the other side, you know, I'm I'm blessed to be able to try, at the very least, attempt to make that map of my ignorance, and then see, well, what are these uncharted territories, and how do I start filling in these blanks? And as I fill in those blanks, and these new territories open up, and the map is not a territory, but to be in this continuous process of learning is a fundamental thing for me. And it's intellectually, but even physically, as I said. I can't just go and jog on the street, but I love hiking. Like, anytime anybody wants to team up hiking with me, and I love to take a different route at a different time of a day, and I'm just so curious about the world. I think it's also related to the fact that I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore, which is Soviet Union. And, my family's life was really marked. I remember my father saying how, he dreamt to go here or there or whatever, but, we were behind the Iron Curtain, and we were not the friends of the regime. And so our movements were very severely curtailed. And also, I've grown up with a story that, if I were my father's generation, I would have already been identified as the enemy of the state and sent to, prison. I mean, depending, if I was my grandparents' generation, I would have ended up in a gulag. And if it was my dad's generation, I would have ended up in a psych ward or in a prison, right? Because that's how the regime used to dispose of political prisoners, or any kind of political threats. So I do not take my freedom for granted, and I always live with this weird feeling that, you know, I don't know, like politically, the situation. So currently, the country that I hold my passport from is called Lithuania, and we are very much at the front line. I don't know if you've been following a lot of events that have been happening in Belarus this past summer with the elections and the opposition leader winning, and then the dictator, the last so-called dictator of Europe, not wanting to relinquish, and then her having to flee, and then that sort of mobilizing a lot of hostility between the Lukashenko regime and hence, who's supported by Putin regime on the border, mobilization of the armies, and then besides that, also. the recent construction of the new nuclear plant that is just 50 kilometers, outside of the capital. And so many of the safety regulations have been broken in the building of that. And we know what happened with Chernobyl, and I'm a Chernobyl baby. My parents actually were very nearby. My mom was pregnant with me when Chernobyl blew up. So my life, was never taken for granted. I could have, somehow, I was born and I had some health issues, but more or less, I'm still here today, which is a bit of a miracle. And so, currently the situation is very, very tenuous and very, very fragile. And what was happening, during the Trump regime in the US, the destabilization of European Union, of NATO, we could become the new front line again. And Lithuania, although I'm not ethnically fully Lithuanian, my ethnic background is mixed, but that's the country I hold my passport from, right? And it could become it could become the new Crimea, and so I, my passport could become worthless. And people, just a few years ago, people were saying, oh, this is such an extreme scenario, this would never happen. And now more and more people are starting to realize, well, it just takes a few things to fall into place for it to become that. So that being said, I don't take my liberty to learn, to express what I learned, or to travel for granted, because I know just one generation before me, that was not a possibility, and that would have potentially led to imprisonment, death, etc., etc., etc. So it fundamentally sets me in that understanding that, um, on one side, these seemingly unvanquishable totalitarian regimes, that seem to be there forever and ever, and there's no pathway out of them, actually do fall and do collapse, oftentimes more than anything under their own weight. Um, and then on the other side, watching what had happened to Russia, and I definitely recommend to everybody a really amazing book by Masha Gessen. Yeah, The Future is History: How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. Um, so, it shows also about a very different path, right? That different parts of the collapsed Soviet Union had taken, and in some ways, the similar structures of the regime have come back with a vengeance. In this case, for example, in a place like Belarus, right? It's just 50 kilometers from the city that I spent the last years when I was still living in the country of my birth. And just 50 kilometers across the border, it's a radically different reality. And it was just a series of historical circumstances and certain political choices that were taken that led to very different lived experiences of people that are just less than 100 kilometers apart. So I think that's a huge motivator. So pathological curiosity on one side, not taking one's freedom, be it to think, to express, or to move around the world for granted, and wanting to learn and to see things and to have conversations firsthand while I still can, be it physically due to my health, or be it because of political circumstances. And then last but not least, as I said, fundamentally it's a survival strategy, especially as a futurist. I see a lot of dark things, I hate the actually, dark is such a wrong word, because it's still, this racism and colorism encoded within even our language. But let's say, I see a lot of these potentially, dystopian essentially scenarios happen way before general audiences would see that happen. When QAnon started emerging, and a lot of my friends, colleagues, sort of more, let's say, liberal leaning people, like centrist liberal leaning people, I was saying like it's a joke. This is not serious. Like nobody, like why would this become a thing? And I said, well, wait and see. This is going to become a new religion. And as absurd and things like Pizzagate were, it blew up amidst a certain population. Now there's millions and millions of people fanatically believing truly just extraordinarily absurd type of things that have no basis in reality, but for them they do. So, seeing a lot of these dystopian things emerge before, and seeing this, having capacity due to my research to see some of the worst case scenarios, it's very difficult to not give in to despair, right? It'd be very easy to just sort of say, well, things are really fucked. And so for me to work on crafting, like very active work to craft something better, something more hopeful, something more inspiring, and work, especially with the artists, musicians, digital artists, illustrators, animators, motion graphics artists, um, writers, scholars across different disciplines, to try and imagine something you know, that would contain this radical hope and radical tenderness within it as part of Protopia Futures as a project. It's really a way for me to not lose hope on a very personal level. To create something that is hopeful uh, is really what helps me to not lose hope, to not just say, well, might as well die tomorrow. To having made that choice, and at some point in my life I made a very conscious choice to live, to actively live, to actively be alive, because it was not necessarily, you know it was not necessarily coming automatically to me. And when I made that choice, I decided to live to my full capacity and to engage with living world to my full capacity. And so I think what I do right now, and especially Protopia Futures as a project, the seeds of it have, you know, I think, it started like more than 10 years ago. I mean, potentially all the way in my childhood, but let's say, I started really being in this research field like over 10 years ago. Um, but Protopia Futures, the project, really came together in the early stages of the pandemic. And for me, that was also one of the survival strategies to do something that would allow me to reconnect with people that I really love, in this general feeling of hopelessness, to actively create hope, was something that was very, very important for me on a personal level, but also I saw that it had a very similar effect on my collaborators as well. So maybe that's enough of my one of my motivations behind it.
Well, thank you very much for your openness. What I'm really interested in is because you said there was this moment of active choice to decide for life and living to your full capacity. Is there Was there a turning point at this stage in your life, something that happened specifically, or before that, were there any specific turning points that made you the person that you are today?
Uh, I mean, look, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of things that happen in my life, and I don't want to go into every bad story of, related to abuse and assault and sexual assault and things like that. But I think a really big shift happened in my mid 20s. I had an accident. I drowned, and I was put on life support. I basically died, and then I was revived because somebody managed to notice me on time and fish me out, and then I was hospitalized on life support for a while. And my eyesight was severely damaged, and I mean, I was in a really, really bad physical state, and so it took me to, I mean, luckily it was not like a car accident, so I didn't have like broken bones and whatever. It was mostly like very severe lung damage. Um, but you lose, after 2 weeks on sort of, an intensive care unit, you lose all your muscles, you lose like, and so you kind of really need to relearn a lot of stuff, and your body and your mind, everything is a struggle. It's quite a severe struggle. Um, and yeah, it just made me realize how, wow, this body is a gift. This body is a gift. I must be grateful, I must not abuse it. I must take care of it. I must be tender with it. I must bless it. I must thank it, and everything that it affords while it affords it. Just be thankful. So and also it really, because it was a very silly accident. I was simply just overworked and exhausted, and I just, I lost consciousness essentially, because of just general physical and mental and emotional exhaustion. Just passed out and drowned. It was in Japan in a hot springs, and it made me realize, like, wow, life is very, very fragile. It really, really is. um, it could happen any moment, and I've dealt with severe insomnia for most of my life, and so literally, like, all through my 20s, I would basically be sleepwalking. So whether I was crossing the street, I was doing a lot of things, I was driving, I was exhausted like most of the time. And when you're exhausted, when you're not paying attention to the world around you, like bad things can happen very easily. You don't know when the car can hit you. You don't, like, it's, you put in your life on such a, I mean, you can never control things fully. And I think this pandemic has really shown that. Some people were, quite reckless and didn't catch COVID. Some people were really, really paying attention, and a small tiny human contact was enough for them to catch COVID, and they got very, very sick. um, but as much as you can, you should not put things to such a chance, because this life is really a gift. This body is a gift, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes we experience severe pain, be it psychological or physical. But we must treasure it, and we must treasure every single moment that we have on this planet. I think there are people, of course, that live with unbearable pain, and I respect their choice to opt out of that pain. But at least in my case, and when I can only speak about my reality, um, I realize that life is a very temporary thing, and you never know what's going to happen when. And so while you're able to do these things, while you're able to engage with other people's bodies in a joyful manner, while you're able to engage with a living world in this joyful and symbiotic manner, you really must not wait until your retirement to do that. So I think that really led me to really reconsider a lot of my relationships, and again, with my very own self, but also more than anything with the living world, because it's the living world that really, things from my childhood, having been in quite a deep relationship with the living world when I was a kid, um, quite connected to a lot of indigenous traditions, knowing the plants and the mushrooms and medicinal things within the forest, and planting things in the soil. Um, I feel like I've forgotten that through my late teens and my early 20s, because I was so focused on just work, work, work. And then I realized that um, it's not about productivity. It's not about how much you produce, it's not about quantity, it's about how much impact what you do has. And the way for it to have impact, you really need to engage and think about things deeply, and learn things in this very deep way. And you cannot do that if you just are in this continuous state of utter self inflicted exhaustion. Um, you know, I mean, it was not just self-inflicted. As I said, it was a legacy of historical trauma, a legacy of personal trauma, etc., etc. So it's not just self-inflicted, but you say I wasn't helping myself, and so it was really important for me to reconsider how maybe I have to do less. But what I do, I have to really show up for it. I have to be really present for it. Um, and that's what I've been trying to do ever since. And sometimes you still forget and you still roll into the old pattern. But I feel the experience of dying is such an extreme, such a strong experience. It never goes away. It is potentially the strongest thing that you will have ever experienced until you actually die. And so whenever things get really hard, I always turn back at it. And I don't see that as a negative. I don't want people's pity for what happened to me. I see it in a way as this measure that when I look back at it, I know that I've chosen life. And once I've chosen life, I have to continuously choose life. And that's in everything, in how I live, in the relationships that I choose, in the kind of stuff I engage with in the world. And at the same time, there's something really quite interesting to be said about that. I've watched also some of the people, ones that experience something extreme, or ones if they're dealing with something really extreme, they'll say, "Oh, I want no negativity in my life. Just positive things only." That's not my case. I definitely, for me, it's very important uh, to 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 really see all aspects of reality, and all aspects of human experience. Um, but I don't want to engage with toxicity, and sometimes it's just easier to, sometimes you just have to block people, sometimes you have to exit certain spaces, sometimes because that the negativity that they direct towards you is too overwhelming, and maybe you will be able to come back to it at a certain point when you're strong enough, but currently maybe you need to refocus on truly you know interactions and knowledge that expands you rather than closes you down and makes you have to sort of always be you know defensive, and that's and I'm speaking about that more than anything from, I think it's very different from for people who've grown up with the experience of privilege. I think, if you've grown up with experience of privilege, especially the extreme privilege, of whiteness and cis heteronormativity, and ability, etc., etc., you've been essentially comfortable for most of your life. Even if small things have happened that were personal traumas, those were not institutionalized traumas that were inflicted upon you, right? It was not part of the larger machine that was trying to crush you. Then, in a way, I think you have a real duty to step out of your comfort zone and to engage with it, right? However, when we talk about people that are on the receiving spectrum of violence, right? So, um, you know, minority genders, people outside of this heteronormative framework, people that have been at the receiving end of, any sort of imperial action, with experience of being a refugee, having to, live in exile, etc., etc. People within the realm of disability. You know, it's, sometimes you really, you cannot exhaust anymore yourself in trying to prove your humanity, right? So it's not for Black people or Indigenous people to try and prove their humanity, and to manage the sort of emotional drama of white or light skinned people. It's not for people who are trans or gender queer to try and prove their humanity and to sort of tiptoe around the violent edifice of cis heteronormativity. It's not for people who live with various forms of disability and who are affected by our pervasive societal ableism to try and prove their humanity to the abled community. Because at some point it can be incredibly violent and it can be dehumanizing, and that dehumanization just sort of adds up. And so, at some point, you really have to say, well, if I'm a disabled person and these, able people are my allies, or let's say, if I'm a Black or Indigenous person, and these white people say that they love me and they're my allies, at some point it is their duty to step up, and actually to elevate the humanity of the marginalized person towards their peers. It's not for the marginalized always to try and do their humanization within the overwhelmingly dehumanizing context. And also it represents a very real violence. For example, as a woman, especially as a woman that works with science fiction. I'm not as much in games, but I have some of my friends who have been in the gaming world, who had like these massive hatred campaigns directed at them, right? That literally put their life in danger. And very strategically so, to push them out of those fields. And so for myself, because of my political outspokenness, especially within the realms that oftentimes are really treasured by the sort of especially these incel communities who love their sci-fi to remain racist, misogynist, homophobic, all these things. um, you know at some point I can't engage with those audiences anymore. I'm not there to convert the Nazis, because Nazis literally not only they want to kill me, but they very much try to kill my ancestors. And so I must also consider my own safety. Yeah.
So you talked about life and death, and to look at the global level of life and death. I recently, when people ask me what my outlook of the future is that I'm saying that I believe that we are actually collectively committing suicide at the moment, the way things are running right now. And first of all, I'd be interested how you see that, if you agree or what your perspective is. And also the question, I mean, when we look at the human being exists now as Homo for 2.5 million years. And actually, I mean, if we are the second to last or even last generation to experience humanity, it's actually an exciting thing, isn't it?
Oh, I try to not entertain the too much of the doom and gloom. Um, okay, so several things. Uh, I am profoundly anti-accelerationism, because I've been seeing predominantly men, actually, predominantly privileged men, not exclusively white men, to embrace accelerationism, and saying that, well, this societal structure is doomed. We need to accelerate its demise, and then what will be born of its ruins, then we can sort of start anew. And I think it's a similar sort of spiritual bypass to spiritual, political, whatever, social bypass, to the idea of Earth is fucked, let's colonize Mars, and or colonize space, and we're going to create new societies there. For me, it's a it's a really dangerous cop out, because you know ultimately what happens when any disaster like that happens, it's people that are already at the greatest receiving end of violence that will suffer the most, right? So if we precipitate any catastrophe like that, it will be indigenous people, it will be disabled people, it will be queer people, it will be feminine people that will be at the greatest receiving end of violence, right? And if something really horrendous happened in the United States of America with the pandemic, when initially there was this sort of paranoia about it, and then it was a combination. On one side there was this whole Western exceptionalism, which is like, well, it cannot happen here, and then in fact people sort of started caring about it. But when the first numbers started coming out and a lot of white folks realized that, well, black and brown people are dying disproportionately from it, especially within the political establishment. I'm talking about GOP and conservative political establishment. Um, there was this thing where, like, well, actually, if black and brown people are dying disproportionately, then even if some of us die, even if some people within our families die, we don't really care, because it will kill more of them than more of us. So we'll take some of those hits as long as it kills more of them. And some of that was also really horrendous, political calculation, because black and brown people, and especially, for example, black women in the U.S., disproportionately vote Democrat and not Republican. So for the Republican Party, it was in a direct interest to see, especially in the states where some of those races are very, very, very close cut, the more black and brown people die, the more beneficial it is for the Republican Party. Now, the how to say, the chickens come home to roost, oftentimes, and sort of that boomerang swings back. And we've seen that so much during this pandemic, that at some point, when we were much later stages of the pandemic, and there was this massive anti-vax sentiment that affected all of the communities, but especially were affecting people in the Midwest, which were predominantly Republican constituencies. And so when it was predominantly Republicans that did not want to get vaccinated and started disproportionately dying, some of these Republican politicians were like, oh shit, now it's our voting bloc that is dying. Oh, guys, go get vaccinated. You know what I mean? And similar stuff happened in Russia, right? Like, Russian sort of cyber army was very actively engaged to disseminate, especially vaccine hesitancy, but also mask hesitancy, and just COVID hesitancy in general in the former peripheral European countries, especially countries that they have quite a bit of a sort of actively hostile engagement with. So Ukraine, the Baltic states, etc., right? And so they're spreading a lot of, vaccine, mass, COVID disinformation, but some of that disinformation started filtering back into Russia. And so right now, even under Putin's regime, he's struggling to get his population vaccinated. Something that initially was supposed to target what was identified as the enemy, this information starts seeping through the cracks and then starts sort of growing, in an organic way as well. Which also what happened with the 2016 election. There was very strong, Russian cyber arms operation in collaboration with some of the right-wing American actors, such as especially Robert Mercer and Cambridge Analytica and all that. But once they sowed a lot of these seeds, with the later election, they didn't even have to do much sort of anymore, because it just sort of started growing in its own kind of organic way, and in some case, harming some of these more institutional Republican figures, right? As the the so-called conservative populations that are going in a more and more sort of extreme direction. Even some of the people that initially supported that kind of disinformation, it turned back against them, which in general just tells you how to sow hostility and to expect that it will never come back at you, is a really, really misguided notion. And it's a very, very short-term strategy. Um, So I'm thinking that I forgot what was the initial question because I went on this whole massive tangent.
Yeah, well,
Please remind me.
yeah, of course. I have the impression that we as humanity are committing suicide at the moment.
Oh yes, I remember it. Yeah, so the end of the world, right? So
May I add something to it? Because I hope you didn't misunderstand my question. It's not that I'm saying that it will happen definitely, but I think that the way we are moving forward at the moment is that's what we are doing right now. And then the solution that I see, and I see it as a true, I don't see Mars as a solution, as you don't see it, obviously. But I think the only solution really to avoid collective suicide in the sense of humanity dying is that we elevate our consciousness to the next level. That's the only way we can do it, from my perspective, and in collaborative effort. And I believe people like you being leaders of this movement of raising consciousness and elevating to the next level of consciousness. But what I see at the moment is that humanity is dying. I mean, it's just my perspective. And if we don't raise to the next level of consciousness, this is what's happening from my perspective. And even if that happens, I personally say, well, I mean, everything has an end, and then at least I experience the end or almost the end. So I'm also not afraid of dying because of my belief system, you could say. But I think it's really important, and maybe you disagree. But I think it's really important to see where we're standing at right now. And if we continue like like this, the way we've been acting over the last couple of decades, I don't see humanity living on in 50 years or 100 years from now. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts, and I'm interested what you have to say.
yeah, so yeah, several things. Personally, I agree with the fact that if you ask me as a futurist, what are the chances of the long-term survival of human civilizational construct as we know today? Um, I consider these chances very, very slim. I put them at like single digit percentages, by the end of the century. At the same time, as somebody that is a future designer, um, my position to it is that even if it's the tiniest, tiniest, tiniest percentage, I've chosen to live and I'll do everything um, to not allow these things to happen, right? To work towards as much of a positive future as possible. Within indigenous frameworks, there's a profound understanding that you do not live just your own life. So your life gives the meaning to the generations, but especially the three generations preceding yours. So whatever happened in their life, whatever pain, suffering, exploitation, etc., that they've experienced, if you are able to give meaning to it, if you are able to turn it around, if you are able to create change, then in a way, you give meaning to the sacrifices that they've made. And then you yourself, you are laying the foundation for the generations to come after you, right? So even if there's a lot of change that you will not see in your lifetime, and then we see that within sort of indigenous architectural and agricultural systems, etc., etc. There's beautiful example of that in the Meghalaya states. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. In India, these sort of root bridges that are literally, it's about humans guiding the growth of these roots, and it's the only type of bridges that survive the extreme monsoon climate, that do not get washed off. Concrete, wood, steel, any other bridges get washed off through the extreme monsoon rain floodings. But those tree root bridges, they survive. But nobody who sort of starts a bridge will see through their lifetime the completion of that bridge. So it's something that takes generations, but that's what you absolutely do, because you know that you have to set the foundation, you have to give the meaning, you have to sow the seeds for the future people to come. So I also think that a lot of things that I'm fighting for, that I'm living for, it might just really consist of opening the door so that others could walk through them. And if I am not able to achieve it, as long as others would, as long as somebody else would take that, would take those, if I planted the seed and they carry those seedlings in a more fertile area, a lot of actually so many of my references, especially with the pandemic, because I've been gardening quite a lot. I've been planting these medicinal plant gardens where I've been staying. And because I don't have like a fixed abode, I've been staying in different places, and every place I plant a garden. And so when I leave, the owner has a garden of medicinal plants, which is also my way of leaving something. Um, so many of my references have come from this idea of growing and cultivating a garden, rather than building like world building or like these sort of like very much engineering type of perspectives. I think when we're talking about change, when we talk about um, you know any fundamental sort of evolutionary kind of aspects, it's never engineering a building, it's always more about growing. So there's element of structure, of a plan, of a map to it, but it never really represents the territory or that kind of engagement and improvisation that it requires. Because when you plant a seed, you don't know exactly how it's going to grow, how strong that seedling is going to be, what potentially might be the weeds. And then in indigenous cultures, we don't see most of the things, we don't see them as weeds because they also have their own purposes, etc., etc. So so I look at it from that perspective, right? That you can't just live for yourself or your own life. You're giving meaning to what came before you, and you're setting the foundation for what comes after you. You're fertilizing. Maybe not even foundation is the right reference, but the soil. You are fertilizing. You are nourishing the health of the soil within which certain things will grow. But there's another thing. I think that apocalypticism, it's been prevalent through the history of humanity. However, I think, right now we really are at a stage where technological tools across the board, and I don't mean just sort of nuclear technology, but also things like, geoengineering and biotechnology and genetical engineering, and AI, robotics, etc., nanotechnology. The tools are becoming more and more powerful. Meanwhile, the human sort of the evolution of human culture is way behind actually the evolution of technology, of technological development. And so I even have that equation in one of my talks. I say technological innovation without humanitarian evolution always equals dystopian future. So if we just and that's the problem, right? Like that's the really for me absurd, insulting part of so much of the so-called classic science fiction, is that it imagines sort of this intergalactic space travel in technology that can do all these magical things, but the war generals remain all male, and then somehow in that super technological society, there's still a need for secretaries, and of course those secretaries are women, and of course it's still super racist and homophobic and trans exclusionary, etc., 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 right? And so like I think what we're living today is still very much the consequences of that classic era of science fiction, because a lot of people that are defining political landscape, technological landscape, scientific landscape are people that have grown up with this old sci-fi that was entirely focused on scientific and technological development, and really not enough on the change of our cultural and social and political priorities, let alone of inclusivity within these realms. There's been an interesting article that I think just came out yesterday or just a couple of days ago by Jill Lepore on she coined this new term called Muskism. And so it's very much that sort of future according to Elon Musk. Uh, you know, Somebody coming from a colonial directly benefiting from the colonial history of South Africa, from the apartheid regime, completely not examining any of that, very well known for his for racism, misogyny, etc., within his corporations, becoming this leader that tells us, what is the future of humanity in terms of, space colonization, and even sort of unironically calling his, Mars colonial rover as like, that's cool, colonialism is cool. Let's do more of it, right? Which also speaks a lot to well, what capitalism is and what imperialism is. It needs to continuously expand, and when there's no more where to expand on planet Earth, then we need to keep expanding into space. Side note to that, I personally think that the whole Mars colonialism is a massive bluff, and it's really much more about mining the asteroid belt and retrieving gold, platinum, diamonds, from the asteroid, uranium from the asteroid belt, which would magnify the fortunes of the richest nation states and especially richest individuals, truly by inconceivable amount. So the fortunes that are already obscene, Musk is like now valued at around $300 billion. I mean, it's truly, it's now what I was reading is, and I'm afraid to make a mistake, but it's bigger than the GDP of South Africa, right? And and uh, and that's like the value of one individual, mostly related to the hype. I mean, he's constructed some real companies. He's not the genius inventor himself. A lot of his stuff he just sort of bought and then pushed and whatever. And because we're so willing to heed these stories of colonial technologists, his companies have received a lot of success. Though personally, I believe that the future of electric cars is not about Teslas. It's about much more practical, much more affordable uh, electric vehicles that can be really easily fixed, and especially about electrified public transportation. Um, so much of the stuff is built around that bluff, but the truth is that somehow it's people like him and Jeff Bezos um, who have defined what is the future narrative, and they've taken their future narratives from so much of the science fiction. And what's interesting is that they completely misread the science fiction, right? So somebody like Ian Banks uh, explicitly stated that he saw himself as absolutely politically as a socialist, and he imagined this futures beyond beyond money, etc., and yet it seems that a lot of these tech bros, billionaire tech bros, have taken these inspirations as completely decontextualized from a larger political narrative than these stories were delivering. Um, and obviously, they seem to be completely unaware of the actual decolonial sci-fi, especially written by women of color, queer people, etc. But um, to your question, where we're going as humanity, I think there's obviously many trajectories that we could be taking. But fundamentally, I see two forces driving us. And unfortunately, they are quite stratified across generational lines, across settler versus indigenous lines, um, uh, and so on and so forth, right? Um, but I think the biggest distinction is generational line and settler versus indigenous line. Um, so a really, you know, actually a really terrifying aspect to that is that, and when I found that out, I was stunned. um, dead people are giving more money to the Tories in the UK than the living. Meaning, it's not just old people screwing up the youth, it's literally dead people continuing to screw up the living. So, as people are passing, especially the ones that had, really wrought relationships with their younger descendants, or maybe they didn't have descendants, etc., etc. A lot of them are leaving money to the Tory party in their wills. And I've been seeing that rift, when you see the generational wealth, and it's not true to every country. Like, it's quite different, for example, in a country like Lithuania. But let's say within a country such as the United States of America, when you see the generational wealth, baby boomers have captured the greatest amount of wealth. Gen Xers have a fraction of it, but predominantly because of some of these very, very wealthy people. And then millennials and Gen Zers, especially if you would take away, somebody like, Mark Zuckerberg's and a few tech billionaires' fortune, you would take away the richest ones that are forming the exception, and you would just look at the general sort of millennial wealth. These are tiny, tiny percentages in terms of, real estate ownership, in terms of just actual monetary wealth, and wealth, unfortunately, still represents power. And as these younger generations are having more and more intense falling outs with their elders because of political disagreements around racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, conspiracy just as QAnon, anti-vax, et cetera stuff. A lot of these younger people are literally getting cut off by their families. And let's say, within the context of a pandemic, parents being anti-vax, believing that their, children are lost to God or whatever, because they're queer or something like that. And if the parents would die at that given moment, they literally might be leaving the younger generation with no wealth, and leaving that wealth to a particular extreme right wing QAnon adjacent Republican, or maybe not even Republican, but like fully some kind of right wing fund. To further fund, homophobic, anti-climate change, extractive, racist, et cetera, policies. And you're seeing that right now with the hysteria around, critical race theory, where any conversation about the actual real history of the United States of America, how the American dream is actually undergirded by American nightmare. It's a dream built on indigenous genocide by the stolen African people through the transatlantic slave trade. It's not really a dream. It actually is a nightmare that benefited the few, while have harmed and literally killed so many. And as that history starts being told, and initially it kind of all started off with Nicole Hannah Jones's Project 6019, where she examined how she and the journalists and the writers that she collected, she examined how the extreme form of American capitalism, um, the policies around guns, the policies around lack of universal health care, even if it's supposedly the wealthiest nation in the world, how these things, they're not some kind of just randomly unique thing about America that distinguishes them from all other wealthy nations, sort of rich nations, through imperial extraction. Um, but it really, it really is related to the history of enslavement. Wall Street, is named by the wall at which, enslaved people were auctioned off. The first bonds were not given upon the land or any other forms of wealth, but were given upon the people, right? And so it sort of undergirds a lot of that stuff. And so there's a massive pushback by the parents to avoid their children to be taught the actual historical facts. Even, and it's not about, critical literary theory was only taught really in higher degree educations and predominantly within the realm of legal studies. Within schools, especially K-12, nobody was teaching critical race theory, but even teachers that were attempting to show not just the the sort of whitewashed history, glorifying, the plantation economy and stuff like that, but actually trying to show the perspectives of the enslaved peoples, and to put more prominently any of the Black authors that deal with any of these subjects, are being accused of, teaching critical race theory and trying to precipitate the race war, which is completely absurd. But at the root of that lies not wanting to have your children to confront the true history that also implicates you as a parent, that implicates the privilege within which they have grown up, and and ultimately would create a rift. If the young people, while they're still receptible, would understand these things, they would start questioning their own, at least some of them might start questioning their own complicity, might start questioning their parents' behavior, might start questioning their generational wealth, etc., etc. I mean, maybe I'm too hopeful about it, but at least some would. And so the parents are deliberately trying to cut off any of that. And so I think what is happening right now is you have some incredibly hopeful, not just sort of a progressive, because for me that's still a word that is very tied with also colonial project of progress, which tended to be exploitational. But what I see as a future political division is not so much left and right, conservative, progressive, or let alone conservative and liberal. I mean, we're seeing how much sort of centrist liberalism is actually rather getting in bed with the so-called not just conservative but really like fascist causes. When it's comfortable for them. So I see the future division around extractive politics, and which is about winners take all. It's about extracting, seeing the living world as natural resources that we as humans, from a very Judeo-Christian perspective, the man to will upon his dominion, we have the right to take, exploit until there's nothing left. Uh, but similarly, seeing that relationality also, with other life forms, and especially with other humans, and especially within the geopolitics, right? So, rich nations aren't just rich and poor nations aren't just poor. I mean, these are, former colonial nations that had their wealth extracted back in the day and that continue having their wealth extracted. Um, and and so that's extractive politics. And on the other side, what I see is this emergent youth that are representing regenerative politics, that are recognizing that a lot of damage has been done, that sustainability is not enough, that we actually need to actively repair, be it socially, politically, culturally, but even within the sort of the so-called environmental thought. It's not enough to stop releasing carbon or methane or whatever. We really need to fundamentally restructure our food systems, our energy systems, our urban design, and we need to really also consider such projects such as rewilding, and not just urban rewilding and creating natural corridors and regenerating the ecosystem, but even rewilding our cities. What does that mean? And we could go much deeper into the subject with you if you want. Um, so, there's these two visions. On one side, there's this regenerative vision, which is about we need to recognize what has been done, these traumas, these wounds, and the need for the reparations over that. And then on the other side, we have extractive politics that are disguising themselves with many names, that are offering these sort of magical techno fixes, that are, offering, crypto is the solution to everything and anything. It doesn't matter that right now it's one of the most polluting industries for no good reason at all. But wait and see, it's going to become this magical thing. But ultimately, these are all many names for furthering extractive practices. And, I believe that the vision of regenerative futures is much more compelling. The people that are fighting for it, and again, obviously, I don't want to be ageist. The people within older generations that have been, environmental activists, that have been queer activists, that have been disability justice activists for their entire lives. They are our elders. They are the ones upon whose shoulders we standing. We wouldn't be here without them. At the same time, if we look at the exact sort of like voting directions and what type of preferences, the older generations tend to, the refugee crisis and preventing refugees entering their countries, is so much higher on the priority list of the elderly people. And then, climate issues and biosphere collapse is much higher on the list of the younger people. And they, on the contrary, I mean, in the country where I'm from, a lot of the younger people are saying, well, actually, the country is way too homogenous. In fact, inviting more people and creating programs that facilitate people from different parts of the world coming and taking residence in our country could really enrich, cultural life, technological life, like all kinds of aspects of our life. It's a good thing. We need to be more open. Meanwhile, the old people are being completely paranoid about it. But the problem is that I think that regenerative vision is much more compelling. People that represent that, that are driven more by hope, by love, by desire to do something good, it's a much more of an energizing type of a thing than being driven by hate. At the same time, there's a lack of those visions. When we talk about mainstream media, which unsurprisingly, is still being predominantly owned and produced by people representing, baby boomer, or, sort of your Ridley Scotts of the world, or, who keeps perpetuating misogynist, racist, cis heteronormative tropes, across most of his work. Or the older Gen Xers. The problem with that is that we don't have as many of those compelling visions. And whenever we get any vision that is supposedly sort of anti-imperial, anti-extractive, then there's always this sort of white male savior being centered within that narrative, which still, becomes, still remains quite alienating for everybody who is not like white cis hetero male. So there's a lack of these compelling visions, because people that are in the positions of power to produce such content, they are not fully on board with these values. But the biggest issue that I still see is really is what I spoke about. It's not just, it's literally dead people leaving their wealth, not to the young generations, but to causes that even after their death could be perpetuating the violence upon the living. And I think that is something that is really, really not being discussed enough about. And we see that across. Like we see that, like so much of the stuff that's happening within African politics, is still the continuation of what during the sort of the decolonial times, there was a rise of some really, really inspiring Pan-Africanist figures that got, assassinated or pushed out by the former colonial powers. And in their place, the certain dictators have been put in that were ultimately the pawns for the former colonial powers. And a lot of these people are still in power today. What is happening currently in Sudan? People are demanding the change of the regime, and they've been on the streets putting their lives on the line. Meanwhile, the international media is, either ignoring it or just giving it sort of one tiny glimpse and never centering what is happening there, while the military regime is being supported by the powers from the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So, so they're getting disproportionate funding because there's an interest to keep that exploitative military regime in power and to not listen to the voice of the people. So, I think there's these two visions, and they are absolutely clashing. And I think what is really fundamental right now is to really think, well, what is that yes vision of the future that we want to walk, and that we want to work towards? What does that look like? What does it look like for us to come together and to understand how, for example, a climate issue is really, it's an umbrella issue, right? It's not, what I'm seeing a lot is specifically, more like white male environmental activist. There's been in the last few years, and also historically, even. I mean, the historical roots of the eco-fascism. I mean, basically Nazis. They were eco-fascists, right? They cared a lot about their living world, and so they cared about it so much that it required to kill millions and millions of people to preserve their Lebensraum. And we see those trajectories right now as well. But the point is that we're not going to solve these environmental issues if we do not address how they intersect with women's issues, with indigenous issues, with disabled people's issues, etc., etc. They are together. And you can't address women's issues without addressing disability issues, and you can't address for example, issues of racial discrimination without addressing disability as well. When we talk about police brutality in the US, it is disproportionately directed at Black disabled people. Like, truly extraordinary amount of deaf Black people got shot by police. And yet that is often not being put forward. How, when Blackness and disability intersect, that's when police brutality and discrimination like truly shoots through the roof. Like, that's where you really become at the bottom of the bottom, of within that sort of, yeah, within the violence that's being directed towards you, and how your life is truly becoming endangered at every single step. So and I think we have to see these things truly as connected, and we need to start demanding stories that actually explore that, because we can't. That's another huge thing. There's an interesting book by Lynn Kelly, Memory Code, and on indigenous memory systems. And then, also another brilliant author, Tyson Yukapura, that I definitely recommend. There's a couple of podcasts I did with Tyson. I was a huge fan, of his work, and then he started inviting me to to converse with him on his podcast, which was like, wow, okay, that's amazing. But what indigenous cultures recognize is that the story is never just a story. It's never just a distraction. It's never just something that you just do to not think about life. In fact, with an indigenous culture, every single thing, be it a design of a particular object and inscriptions on it, or or a dance, or a song, or a particular narrative. None of that is just entertainment. All of it, within oral cultures, all of these things, they were ultimately sort of containers of knowledge. And the reason why they were in the form of a song or a dance, of a sort of spatialized ritual, is because, from the perspective of neuroscience, actually this is the best way to consolidate memories. When you're just learning something, in the within a sort of flat written format, you're just reading something from a book, which is the dominant form of education within the so-called, I mean, more or less everybody's literate in the world, but I say, the Western civilization construct is very much about literacy, right? The written word. And when you learn from the written word, you actually don't consolidate memories in such a visceral manner, and you don't remember as much as within the oral cultures. And the reason why I remember things within oral cultures in a much more profound way is because it is attached to a physical place, is attached to a movement, is attached to a sound. And so it really goes in much deeper, right, within your mind, and you store that knowledge, and you're able to sort of bring it out. And sometimes you need to store it over generations, right? Sometimes it's 10 generations that have not experienced that drought, but because they still have the stories of how to find a particular watering hole in a desert, once the drought strikes, you still remember that path, because that is the ritual path that you used to walk, during sort of your yearly ceremony, etc., etc. What I'm trying to say through that is that through the human evolutionary history, we are wired for stories. We never just listen to a story and it just kind of goes through the other, through the other ear. Let alone when something is not just the words that we read in a book, but it's also something visual, it's also some kind of cultural phenomenon, etc., etc. It's never just entertainment. Like media, and especially now as we're moving into sort of gaming and immersive media technology, the more immersive it is, the more it actually is the modern day mythology. Like superheroes are, all the new gods, right? And they come with their myths, and those myths, they present certain values within themselves that then inevitably guides us in our everyday perceptions of reality and our everyday interactions with other humans. And I think a lot of the mainstream narrative, especially within science fiction, as much as I am a fan of the potential of science fiction, I think overall science fiction, as we have seen, has done more harm than good. A lot of the superhero stuff has done more harm than good, because there's a very deep eugenics through line through a lot of that. So a lot of superheroes that somehow, either in narratives such as Dune the movie, they were literally bred through this eugenics program. That's why they're really powerful. Or they or they had some kind of contact, or they belonged to some kind of secret society, of the superhumans, whatever, whatever. And when we start telling that, it's only those kind of people, and through that very Joseph Campbellian idea of hero's journey, that are able to change the world, the message that it ultimately sends is that, well, you as a regular person, you can do nothing about it. And it's always these magical individuals that are able to do that, rather than a community coming together. And then a lot of the attributes of these magical individuals, they tend to be attached to cis heteronormativity, not just ableness, but this sort of eugenic idea of beauty, strength, power, etc., etc. Which further perpetuates these misconceptions within our lived reality of who is worthy, who's unworthy, who's good, who's bad, etc., etc. And most of the time, what we see is villains being coded, as disabled, as queer, as dark skinned or indigenous, or a combination of all of these three, or some kind of weird interaction of these three things. And that further encodes bias into our real world. And so you cannot say that, oh, why are you taking this so seriously? This is just a film, this is just a game, Like, no, actually, from the neuroscience perspective, who we are biologically, we are wired to take in these stories in a very visceral manner. And then they end up guiding, who we are as individuals, as also as society. And this notion, I remember, the one and only time that I went to Burning Man, because I felt like, I can't just like criticize without actually going and seeing it for what it is. And there was, at the end of the booklet, it was this quote saying, "You're the only one responsible for your desires." And I just was like, what of the libertarian nonsense this is? Because you are never the only one responsible for your desires. You've been conditioned to have these desires. Of course, there's certain part of also your own choice, your own personality, etc., etc. But in general, we are born into a culture that even within our language, it dehumanizes the living world. In English, we call, other living non-human creatures it. We see them as things. We see them as these, automatons, which still comes from the era of Descartes and all that, sort of like the so-called Enlightenment, whatever, whatever. We see living world as it. We obviously do not give any idea of consciousness to entities such as forests, hills, oceans, etc., etc. We see them as just dead matter. We call it environment. What does it mean? Environment means some kind of like background for the human action, right? So it's a problem to anthropomorphize things, but it's also a problem when you do the very opposite of that, when you sort of remove any idea of spirit or humanity from everything else that is non-human, and just start seeing that as the so-called natural resources. Natural resources in its very framework implies that, well, this is for us to take rather than, and I mean, examples of that is like, all of these sort of new age spiritual people with like, their spiritual crystals and whatnot. Not that I don't love beautiful crystals. I think, wow, it's so gorgeous. But the way it's being rendered into this consumer product, where we going into these gorgeous crystal caves, cutting them out, making them a product that you can put in a water bottle, because, well, that's going to render, your whichever chakra more open. We don't see how do we participate in this pillaging of the living world. And I think that's encoded in the language. Ableism is completely encoded in our language. We do not blink without saying things like, tone deaf, blind spot, etc., etc., as a way we could just be saying, insensitive, insulting, etc., etc. We don't need to say tone deaf, because that implies that somehow, hard of hearing people are inferior in their perceptions or the intellectual capacities, etc., etc. When we say blind spot, we could just be easily saying blank spot. What we are saying is that, that somehow somebody that is hard of seeing, again, their understanding or perception of the world is absolutely inferior to the able people. And then, of course, racism and colorism is pervasive in our language, and I catch myself every day, and I don't yet have good replacements. Things such as, darkness, it's identified with something negative, whereas, I just did recently this wonderful collaboration with the Hawaiian indigenous artist Solomon Enos, and and he was explaining to me how darkness, how this idea of blackness within indigenous Hawaiian culture, it's really it's this idea of a birthplace, it's of womb, of the potential, like it's not seen as a negative, right? It's where life comes from. But in a Western cultural context, even the notion of something such as, the irony of this idea of enlightenment, which is really the era that that lay the foundation of race pseudoscience and the greatest project of dehumanization that ultimately humanity has committed. Slavery had existed in different shapes and forms across human history, but the sort of such a massive institution of slavery, undergirded by this whole completely artificial, completely sort of pseudoscientific ideology of race, that was created during the time of the Enlightenment. So I don't know, like, maybe Enlightenment is really not the positive thing. Maybe this whole idea of, illumination is not, when we sort of start removing these colorist and racialized context, maybe it's not as positive as we think about it. And then, last but not least, our language pervades with things such as, people really say that, well, these things don't matter, like this is completely insignificant, but things like hey guys, thank guys, whatever, whatever, right? And in a very obvious manner, it can be really marginalizing to people that are genderqueer, and specifically also to trans women. right? So especially when you are sort of in the early stages of your transition and somebody just keeps saying, oh, guys, 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 it keeps evoking the gender that actually you do not relate with anymore. But also it has a much sort of, people try to wash it away and say that, but this is a general term. Guys just means everybody. But my answer to that is, well, ask any strictly cis hetero man, how many guys he has dated recently, or, how many guys he had sex with in his life. And you'll see the reaction, right? He'll be like, no, I don't date guys, and all of a sudden that's very clear, even when you ask somebody like, oh, like, you know, like in other contexts, you could still use that, and people will automatically assume that when you say guys, especially in a sort of sexualized whatever context, it always means a man. But then somehow, when a group of people, we will default to the masculine generalization. And these things, they translate to the terms like, mankind, man-made, etc., etc., etc. And it just participates in further erasure of women's presence, of women's contributions, and obviously of the existence of other sort of genders outside of that colonial binary. And these things seem like they are minority issues, like there's bigger things, like there's bigger fish to fry or something like that, people would say. But unfortunately, no, I think language is very important. Narratives are very important. What we entertain ourselves is very important, because you want it or not, subconsciously, you know it does seep in, and it does permeate your most sort of subconscious choices. And we know that most of our choices are subconscious. So we need to question these fundamentals. And with that, I want to say that uh, you know, none of us are, I mean, very few of us are born into these understandings. Most of us are born into varying degrees of bigotry. And so it takes active work to dismantle that bigotry that we have been indoctrinated into. It takes active ways to peel that off. And when people ask me like, well, what can I do about it? I'm like, well, listen, whatever privilege that you experience, and all of us experience different privileges, we have to prioritize to listen to people that are being affected by the historical exclusion and historical violence, right? So if we're talking about the global pandemic, people whose rights first and foremost should have been centered, should have been disabled people, should have been immunocompromised people, should have been people that are, going through their cancer journeys. And if we would have managed to make it safe for them, ultimately, all of us would have been safe. If right now, when it comes to biosphere collapse, a climate pattern disruption, biosphere collapse, if the voices that we were centering and the lives that we'd attempt to make the safest would be the lives of indigenous people, ultimately, the whole planet will be better off, right? And when we look, for example, into the history of medicine, so science, whatever, and how it used women's bodies, how it used disabled bodies, how it used racialized bodies, and I mean, when it comes to gender, right? So many medicines have been initially only tested on men's bodies because women's bodies were considered to be complicated, right? And women's bodies only considered complicated because we've always defaulted to men's bodies, which resulted in medicines that actually killed women or were ineffective of women, or that did not take into account women's biology, etc., etc. And I'm not trying to be essentialist, right? Like as I said, I see gender way sort of beyond that binary. But the point is that most of the time in any medical testing, the sort of cis hetero male bodies have been prioritized, and that had engendered everybody else. It doesn't, I mean, society where only tiny fraction of the population benefits is not a healthy society, fundamentally, be it culturally or sort of biologically. If we only prioritize one particular voice, and we try to artificially homogenize the society, I mean, any homogeneous system anywhere, like even within computation, the more homogeneous the code, within ecosystems, the more homogeneous a certain sort of environmental ecosystem is, the easier it is to destroy it. Right? The more diverse it is, the more every diverse element plays its own unique part rather than is trying to be forced to conform to the whole. The stronger that ecosystems becomes, and it's not about integration. Even I think a lot about that within things such as refugee crisis and immigration, etc., etc. We'll be seeing, of course, because of the climate issues, we'll be seeing more and more of that. And the good immigrant is not the immigrant that integrates. The good immigrant is immigrant that contributes in their own unique way, because through their culture, through their experience, they have things to offer that local population doesn't have. And that is a wealth.
They enrich, basically.
100%. Right? So
I always say that the ancient civilizations, they actually were enriched and grew through foreigners. And you can see it with the Chinese, the Indian, the Egyptian, the Persians, all high cultures, they actually got enriched through other cultures. And that made them high cultures. But yeah,
yeah, I mean, look, I think it's important to preface that with the fact that some indigenous cultures, they were not on that kind of imperial expansion of their lands, etc., etc. And sometimes their ethnic groups were quite sort of tightly knit. But even within that, it's actually very interesting. I definitely recommend reading the author, Aboriginal Australian author Bruce Pascoe. Um, and his book Dark Emu is very, very interesting. But all of his work and all of his research is very interesting. And he speaks to how within Aboriginal Australian cultures, even if the clans were quite tightly knit, there was actually a very strong cultural exchange. So, even if there was no some kind of empire or nation state construct, compared to, like, let's say Persian Empire, Roman Empire, whatever, whatever, it was very, very different. It was not an imperial project, but there was a strong exchange, and that's why there was so many links between the many Aboriginal ethnic groups and languages across the land. There's still been a very, very strong exchange that was not necessarily militarized. And historically we have so many examples of that. So, like, civilization doesn't have to fit into that settler colonial mold to be a civilization. And especially where we're going into the future, I think we need to really reconsider even some of these fundamental myths of where do humans come from, and that our evolution and the greatest sort of inventions of the human history actually have not been driven by this paradigm of man the hunter. And the most violent is the one that wins. I mean, as humans, we're not the strongest animal. We've never been. What made us flourish and expand and travel across different continents is because we were collaborative. We actually were helping each other. We were learning from each other. We're telling stories with each other. And so the power of collaboration and adaptation is the greatest power that we have, not the power to kill, destroy, exterminate. That is not the evolution idea that we should be sort of obsessed with,
yeah.
and we should really question that, especially in the science fiction narratives. There's something that I still am thinking about, that I try to, in the last few weeks, I did a few podcasts kind of talking about the politics of Dune and why certain the taking inspiration from indigenous cultures and Southwest Asia, North African cultures, without including any of the people. Why that stuff is harmful. Why coding your villain through this sort of fat phobic ableist lens, and how within Frank Herbert's kind of like in Frank Herbert in real life, he was profoundly homophobic, right? He had a son who is gay, and not only that he was gay, he was also activist within that realm. He completely sort of refused his child and refused to accept his child's homosexuality. Not only that, he created this caricature of the evil guy where he equated homosexuality with pedophilia, which is like one of the oldest rules in a playbook, how to trigger the extreme forms of homophobia and homophobic violence. So these are sort of very important things for me to understand how also misogyny pervades not just Dune as a film, but this notion, for example, within Dune, that all of this woman order of Ben Gesserit, they are in this sort of eugenic project of breeding the superhuman only by birthing women, but only when they birth a male child, that child becomes the sort of messiah, becomes the superhuman. Because of course, none of the girls could have achieved those powers, right? It took this lineage of women to ultimately birth a male, which sends the message that like
Produce the ultimate male. Yeah.
exactly, right? Like that, it's a double message. On one side, like woman is only worth half a man, and then on the other side, it's this idea that, well, woman is only a woman if she breeds, which is really really kind of toxic idea. So there's so many kind of things without that, with how as I said, science fiction keeps sort of imagines all these fantastic technologies, but cannot imagine women leaders that are not reproducing these toxic ideas of male power, or simply there's no women leaders in general. But there's something else that I feel like I haven't spoken enough about, that's been really really bothering me, is how within a lot of these sci-fi narratives, what we keep seeing is right now, a lot of studios, they know that diversity sells, right? So they try to cast their films quite diverse, but whenever the film is directed by a white person, and predominantly white men, you see the recurrent trope of the movie starts with a lot of diversity, but by the end of the film, the key white characters survive, and then some of the most beloved, charming, amazing characters played by brilliant actors of color, they not just die, oftentimes they die for the white or for the light skinned characters, not only to live, but to sort of achieve the greater glory, right? And you see it with the films like Dune, you see within films like Infinity War, is this recurrent trope. And I spoke about it on Ken Bai's podcast, and I in a way I gave an open call to the listeners. I was like, please, I'm sure there are examples of otherwise, but currently I can't recall it. So please send me a message, with examples of, a character being played by a white person, in a film directed by a white person, um, who sacrifices so that the character of color, could live and achieve their greatness, right? So the examples of the opposite side are very, very rare. And then another toxic trope is within the love stories. Most of the time, when I think about somebody like, for example, Jason Momoa, right? I mean, Jason Momoa, is very happily married with a black woman, and they're one of the most inspiring couples, one of the most beautiful couples, whatever, whatever, right? However, in almost every film that you've seen him, from Games of Thrones to Aquaman to recent See on Apple TV, literally every single thing, uh, and he's somebody of indigenous background. He's not a black actor. He's somebody of indigenous background. He's still a person of color. Um, all of his love interests are always white. And please send me other examples. So I'm thinking, what, like, how many examples there are of love stories, especially within the realm of science fiction, where it's actually two characters of color that are falling in love with each other, and have the opportunity to consummate their love. So within the recent Apple TV series C, it was this also quite a bit of a cliched character, but still, her acting was amazing, by Alfie Woodard, playing the sort of the CEO of Paris, that is in love with an Asian man. Meanwhile, all of the other characters of color that are the leads within the film, they're all in love with white people. um, and in some way those love stories survive, and the only love story within the film that was between two characters of color, both of them get murdered, and they never get to really consummate their love, and we never get to see them loving each other. And so, it's something I've been recently discussing with the African American filmmaker Celia C. Peters, that we want to write something in much greater depth about it. How this message of continuously sacrificing people of color, within a sci-fi narrative, so that the lighter-skinned, non-indigenous, non-black characters could live and could achieve, the goals of their hero's journey. And same thing within the love storylines, how we never let, unless the film is actually directed by a black woman director, or by a director of color, it's almost, you never get to see a love story that does not center whiteness. And ultimately what it says is that, you know whose lives are disposable, who is less lovable, and it completely keeps reiterating that absolutely racialized settler colonial message, that in fact, it's the black lives, it's the indigenous lives, that are disposable, whose stories are not sort of worthy of our attention, etc., etc. And how ultimately, this is not just entertainment. It results in a natural trauma, and it results not in a natural, in a real life trauma. It perpetuates your feeling of yourself as unworthy, and how it's violent. It's not just entertainment. It's actually a continuation of the violence of your everyday life, even into the fiction. And in order to watch it, in order to appreciate it, in some ways, you need to desensitize yourself so much, that, again, it's forcing you to move away from your very own humanity. And we need to change that.
So, um, yeah, what I'd be really interested in is, in 100 years from now, how would you like to be remembered by the people, your family, other people who were influenced by you?
100 years from now, how do I want to be remembered, and how do how do I answer this without like coming across a megalomaniac? Uh, so I guess at the current moment, my life goal would be to participate in, and I don't mean me by myself. I really mean, uh, me as part of a community. Um, to change the direction of the stories of the future. So I really would like Protopia to become an alternative to Dystopia and Utopia. I'd love it to become sort of a household framework around which we design the futures. I want it to continue expanding. I want people to take it further and way beyond my wildest imaginations. I'd love there to be, protopian future education programs where people are, being taught all of these things that help expand futures literacy. Um, and really as a way to create a stronger resistance around current sort of rampant disinformation situation, disinformation warfare. I think futures literacy is one of the most powerful ways to combat disinformation. Um, And yeah, I want to, I would love to remember to be as one of the people that inspire the new trajectory of future storytelling, you know, that would result in new uh, films, TV series, games, immersive experiences that help us not to just escape or entertain ourselves, but that allow us to imagine, you know, how we could be. Um, you know, truly inclusive, how we could be truly regenerative as a culture, how we imagine ourselves beyond you know, this ableist, racist, misogynist culture that unfortunately we are still so mired in today. So you know, to inspire just powerful story worlds. And I don't even say stories, narratives, because I really, for me, it's very visual, right? It's these immersive story worlds that then allow us to come back to reality and to really think very differently about the cities in which we live in, the very construct of the nation state, the idea of what it is to really be a community, not just with other humans, but with all life here on earth. And you know, to think that maybe some of the work that I'm doing with the people that I love, with all my incredible collaborators, could potentially lay the foundation for this whole new trajectory beyond the cyberpunk, beyond, you know, all of this sort of violent dystopian stuff. uh, I mean, that'd be amazing. You know, that's truly a dream. You know, and to, you know, to make the ground fertile for more beauty and more poetry, and really, you know, what I call radical tenderness. Like, what does it mean for us to relearn how to be tender with each other, and to be tender with ourselves, and to be tender with the living world, to pay attention, to care, to really touch, to really be present, you know, to express more love than we express fear, or violence, or cruelty, or indifference. I mean, to inspire even even a tiny bit of that, you know. I would love that, you know. I would love to, like, you know, watch a film and then somebody said, actually, you know, when I was in school, you know, the professor, you know, showed this talk of yours, and that got me thinking. You know, it's kind of like how, you know, all of these like tech gazillionaires, you know, they inspired by these like completely techno fetishistic ideas of a future, and to think that some kind of, you know, future, you know, truly inspiring, you know, politician or activists or inventor, scientist could say, like, actually, you know, it's, you know, when I was young and lost, you know, I saw some of your work and it changed my world, and that's why I ended up going and doing that. Yo, that's I would be so moved, you know. I would be so moved to lay any ground for more love, more tenderness, more hope, more beauty, more desire to get to know each other in a more profound way.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for this conversation. It was very
My
inspiring.
pleasure. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you for staying tuned for this edition of Challenging Paradigm X. If you like this episode with Monika Bielskyte, feel free to share it with your community so Monika's message gets spread even further. In the show notes, you'll find the links to her work and the books mentioned. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me. We'll see if there will be another edition of Challenging Paradigm X. Therefore, I would truly like to express my gratitude for my listeners who have stayed tuned over the last 2 years. As I'm focusing on another future project now, this is possibly the last episode. For now, at least. We'll see. I might continue with a different format. So, farewell for now. Live long and prosper.